Support for this program comes from Louisiana Companies and Querbees and Nelson, empowering clients with the know-how and products they need with over 100 years of experience. There is much to be learned from our history and the past, and we are proud to support this program and LPB. And by the men and women of the Louisiana Forestry Association. For sustainability, LFA members work to promote the health and productivity of Louisiana's forest for generations to come. And by DIMCO, proud to honor Louisiana's Vietnam veterans. As one of the fastest-growing electrical co-ops in the nation, DIMCO is committed to our members and the community. DIMCO, your touch-tone energy cooperative.
They came from every corner of the state to serve in a war that polarized much of America. 50 years later, Louisiana remembers those who served, those who grieved, and those who fled.
The war in Vietnam is not a war in the classic sense. It is instead a guerrilla war, a hit-and-run war.
A recently discovered film from 1965 followed Louisiana servicemen on the ground at the start of the conflict.
How long have you been here at Da Nang in Vietnam?
Well, I've been to Da Nang 1 month now. I've been in Vietnam 8 months.
And where are you from?
Morgan City, Louisiana.
Morgan City.
Lieutenant Ronald Foltz.
Ronald Foltz of, I believe, New Orleans and Bogalusa, Louisiana.
That's right.
Louisiana and Louisiana citizens played major roles in the war. Many thousands served with distinction, and 882 of them died in combat. Fort Polk, near Leesville, and its infamous Tigerland, trained American soldiers for what they would face. For many, it was unimaginable torture and brutality. Louisiana played a significant role in the air war. Aircraft from England Air Force Base in Alexandria and Barksdale Air Force Base in Bossier City led major combat operations. After the fall of Saigon in 1975, Louisiana helped resettle more than 15,000 Vietnamese refugees in a new land, as war-hardened veterans faced an uncertain and often unwelcome homecoming. Today, these aging heroes face other challenges, but finally find thanks from a grateful nation. For the majority of young men being deployed to Vietnam, their journey from citizen to soldier began in Louisiana. The Fort Polk Army Base in Vernon Parish was the epicenter of basic training for the conflict. Mark Leslie is Chief of Plans and Operations at the base.
Fort Polk acted as a basic training site up until 1975 is when they finally closed it out, the last cycle going through in 1976. During that time, Fort Polk trained over 1 million soldiers to deploy to Vietnam. And it was pretty significant. By 1969, it had deployed more people to Vietnam than any other basic training station in the United States.
Mark Horn was 25 years old and had been teaching school for 2 years before the draft brought him to Fort Polk. From daily exercise, weapons training, and classroom instruction, basic was nonstop.
From the time you got here to the time you left, it was double time and run everywhere you went. And then the temperatures, it's hot. It was a tough life. Start at 5 o'clock in the morning, 3 meals, about 15 total minutes to eat, and work till dark. Then shine your shoes, get ready for the next day amusement, and keep on going.
The Vietnam conflict was the first time the Army tried to reproduce the environment where soldiers were being deployed. Future infantrymen received their training in the mock community of Tigerland.
They replicated the environment by having the villages, the Viet Cong attack civilians or soldiers dressed as Viet Cong or an NVA, and they put them through the paces that way. They replicated the tunnel systems, which were, if you've read anything about Vietnam, you know that's pretty significant in Vietnam.
Tigerland, that was the real deal. That developed you from a boy to a man.
Paul Washington lives in Texas and received his infantry training at Fort Polk. He shared his experiences with LPB at the Vietnam Veterans of America National Convention in New Orleans.
Fort Polk was jungle, it was hot, the terrain is similar to Vietnam. Now I know why they call it Little Vietnam, because when I arrived in Vietnam, it exemplified that. The training was just awesome. The drill sergeant, but they did their job. Even though it seemed like intimidating at that time, but they did their job. I was prepared well to go to Vietnam from Fort Polk, Louisiana.
Every instructor at Tigerland was required to have a combat infantryman's badge, which is earned by serving in combat.
And so they were able to take their personal experience and incorporate it into the training here in Tigerland to make it that much harder, that much tougher, that much more realistic for the soldiers deploying to Vietnam.
Ron Applewhite was a Korean veteran who received his basic training at Fort Polk and returned to become a drill sergeant. He trained numerous Vietnam recruits.
Probably the best job I ever had. To pick them up at the reception station and then 8 weeks later watch them march across the parade field. It was a complete 180-degree change in those folks from civilian to military.
To be successful, soldiers were advised to follow 3 simple rules.
Be where you're supposed to be there on time, and obey orders. And you won't have a problem. Not with me, anyway.
With the motto, "Every man a tiger," Fort Polk transformed the young men entering its gates to be warrior ready.
When soldiers reported to Vietnam and they reported their NCOs and their officers there, one of the first questions they would ask them is where you had trained at. If the answer was Fort Polk, the NCOs and officers had a sense of confidence that they had got the best training possible in the hardest conditions, preparing for what they were going to face in Vietnam.
My job as a platoon leader was to search and destroy. We spent most of our time in the jungle. We were out in the field for weeks upon end. I was in 2 major battles, Firebase Henderson, where we were hit by a battalion of sappers. A sapper is a human bomb. They were strapped with TNT or explosive of sorts. What they do is they lay on the wire and blow themselves up so their troops would be able to come in over them. Now, I'd just gotten out of the foxhole and I put a flak jacket on when I heard a big boom right behind me, and my medic said, "What is that?" And I said, "That's incoming." I don't know whether it was a mortar or a rocket-propelled grenade, but it hit me in the chest, threw me back, and I was hit. So my medic dragged me back into the foxhole, patched me up, and I said, "Doc, I've got to go out." So I went out, covered in blood. I was pulling some of my guys out of foxholes that they had thrown satchel charges in that were all blown up, and just screaming for help. I lost so much blood, I lost consciousness. I was medevaced out along with I don't know how many other guys, and they were still in the firefight. Mortars were still coming in well after I left. I think we lost 27 men, untold wounded, including myself. I was also on Firebase Ripcord. Ripcord was really rough. It was the last major battle in Vietnam. The North Vietnamese were coming through the Asha Valley, the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they were preparing themselves for a big push into the southern part of Vietnam. And we were there to try to block that. We were surrounded by somewhere between 20 to 30,000 in VA, and we had somewhere around 600 to 700 infantrymen in the area, way outnumbered, way outnumbered. So we abandoned that Firebase. Did we believe that we were there to keep South Vietnam from turning into communism? Yes, we were. We were there, in our minds, there to hope that we could keep that from happening.
There were 7 of my buddies. We were all pilots and fresh out of flight school, and 23, 24 years old, 22 years old, and we all volunteered for this outfit called HAL 3. HAL 3 stands for Helicopter Attack Light Squadron 3. And it was an all-volunteer squadron, about 100 officers and 300 enlisted. And it was down in the Delta of South Vietnam. We were part of the flight crews that would fly in support of these riverboat guys that would get caught in ambushes or come under fire. Typically 2 o'clock, 2:30 in the morning, something would happen to these patrol boats that were out on night patrol, and they would get hit. When that guy, an 18-year-old sailor, calls you and says, look, we need help. Your job is to come in and break up whatever resistance there is right away to save their lives. These aircraft were so heavily armed, all hell breaks loose. It's devastating beyond belief. We really were kind of like the cavalry coming over the hill.
I was assigned to the 21st ARVN Division. That's a totally Vietnamese unit that was in the Mekong Delta. It was an infantry battalion that went on operations against the Viet Cong. We lived with the Vietnamese people, and it was very unusual. If a soldier was married and had kids, they were often with us. These were people that weren't there for just a year. They were there for the duration. The countryside that we were in, there were two principal features: rice paddies and heavily vegetated tree lines along canals. We'd be marching along one of these rice paddies, and the Viet Cong would ambush us from the tree lines. Now, it sounds like it would make more sense for us to walk along the tree lines, but we would come upon this homemade sign. It featured a skull, no crossbones, but two words, D Chet, which means go death. It meant Charlie, the Viet Cong, had placed booby traps, and they were warning the villagers. They weren't trying to warn us. Every day in Vietnam, thousands of 105 millimeter howitzer rounds were fired, and a number of them didn't detonate. And the Viet Cong would police them up and rig them. We called them booby traps. Nowadays they call them IEDs. They had all the explosive power that they had when the people put them in the cannon. And if they went off, 2 or 3 men in the immediate area would be killed and others would be wounded. They were a terrible weapon. It's made me wish as a species that humans could find some other way to resolve disputes other than war, because it's so horrible.
Many Louisiana families still don't know what happened to their loved ones who went off to war. 24 men are still listed as prisoners of war or missing in action. Many other soldiers held captive during the war suffered terrifying conditions. One of them was Murphy Neal Jones, who was tortured after his capture near Hanoi in June 1966.
A soldier walked up behind me, stuck his rifle to the back of my head, stood there a couple seconds and pulled the trigger on an empty chamber. What do you think when you think you're going to die? At that point, I really and truly didn't care. Would have welcomed the bullet. I remember thinking, this is a heck of a place to die. I wonder where they'll bury me, and I wonder how long it'll take my family to find out I'm dead.
Jones returned home after spending more than 2,400 days as a prisoner of war. The majority of those days were in the camp known as the Hanoi Hilton. Many soldiers returned home as heroes. Others faced scrutiny. In November 1969, the Cleveland Plain Dealer published photographs of the aftermath of an attack in March the previous year. American soldiers had murdered 504 civilians. Over 40% of the dead were children under 12. Louisiana had several connections to this tragic event and its aftermath. A veteran turned reporter exposed the story and later lived in New Orleans. Another New Orleanian, Congressman F. Edward Hebert, led an investigation. Hugh Thompson was the hero of the story. The helicopter pilot ordered his men to turn their guns against fellow American soldiers to put a stop to the massacre. Thompson moved to South Louisiana after his military career. Trent Angers, a Lafayette author, is Thompson's biographer.
His job was to scout for the enemy, and inherent in his job was to fly along the treetops or along the tree lines and to draw fire from the enemy. And then when they would shoot at his chopper, he would peel back, and his cover, which was a Huey helicopter, would come in and just annihilate the enemy. It started off seemingly as a regular operation. It took a little while for Thompson and his crew to comprehend what was going on. They spot this carnage and they see an irrigation ditch with dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of bodies of dead people. He says, well, what happened here? They couldn't figure it out at first. Larry Colburn spotted a little group of Vietnamese people running for their lives along the hedgerow. They were heading for a bunker, heading for safety because they were afraid they were going to be killed. And in hot pursuit of them were the men of Charlie Company, led by Lieutenant Stephen Brooks. He set his chopper down between the fleeing civilians and the oncoming soldiers with their M16s locked and loaded. He set the chopper down. He told his gunner, Larry, cover me. I'm going to get these people out of the bunker. If our people open up on us, he said, you take them out. Thompson goes into the bunker. He gets the Vietnamese out. There were 11 people in the bunker. He went back to his base, landed the helicopter, took off his helmet, threw it on the ground, went up to his commanding officer and said, I will not be a part of any operation like this. So the commanding officer then radioed Captain Medina and ordered an immediate ceasefire. The ceasefire went into effect immediately, and then and there, as a result of Hugh Thompson's courage and anger, essentially stopped the My Lai massacre.
Thompson would have to show more courage in the aftermath of the attack.
The My Lai massacre was covered up by the officers who were involved at the higher levels because they knew they would be in deep trouble. It was covered up for 15 months.
Americans back home didn't know about the massacre until a veteran who returned to Vietnam as a reporter exposed the cover-up. Ron Ridenour later lived in New Orleans.
The chairman of the House Armed Services Committee was Congressman F. Edward Hebert from Louisiana. He, in concert with President Nixon, did not want any American soldier convicted of a war crime.
Despite intimidation, Thompson testified against Lieutenant William Calley, one of the leaders of the massacre. He was found guilty of murdering 22 Vietnamese civilians at My Lai. It wasn't until 30 years after the massacre that Thompson was awarded the Soldier's Medal. That's the United States Army's highest award for bravery not involving direct contact with the enemy. The red symbols on this B-52 at Barksdale Air Force Base in Shreveport indicate the number of bombing runs or sorties the bomber flew during the Vietnam War. Despite the invaluable part the B-52 would eventually play in the Vietnam conflict, there was debate early on about whether the aircraft should be deployed to the country.
Worldwide, the bomber was known as a nuclear-capable bomber, so it might project the wrong image to nations around, throughout the Southeast Asia area.
Sean Bohannon is a staff historian for the Air Force Global Strike Command, headquartered at Barksdale. After high-level discussions, Bohannon says a contingency force of the nation's B-52s, including those at Barksdale, was modified to carry conventional bombs.
Through these series of modifications, they were able to increase the bomb load to up to 24 externally hung bombs, which effectively doubled the bombing capacity of that aircraft.
When the U.S. began using the B-52 in Vietnam, commanders found that the crews had trouble hitting targets with accuracy. The country's thick vegetation limited their ability to use radar. The first combat evaluation group based out of Barksdale solved the problem by reconfiguring a radar system that it used to score pilots' accuracy in mock bombing runs.
So they used this radar bomb scoring equipment in a reverse order. It created a signal that the B-52s could home in on and fly to their target points. They literally followed the beam in, and it gave them very precise aim points to engage.
Combat Sky Spot was the name for these radar sites placed in Vietnam. The reconfigured system ultimately guided in 75% of every B-52 sortie. Ernest DeWolf operated the radar at Dong Ha in North Vietnam.
When I would get the coordinates of a target, I would certify it and make sure it got put on our tracking board properly, so when we locked onto the airplanes, we could direct them to it and drop the bombs within 5 feet.
Following the breakdown of peace talks in December of 1972, President Richard Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker II, a full-scale air assault on North Vietnam. Phil Blofus, a B-52 navigator in Guam, remembers attending a special briefing on December 16th.
It was very quiet, and a briefer came up and he says, "Your target for tomorrow is Hanoi." And there was a lull in the briefing room. We all wanted to go into Hanoi. We've been wanting to go into Hanoi for years, and of course the restrictions were that we couldn't go in.
When the operation began on the 18th, Blofus says the B-52s created a taxi line similar to a commercial runway.
We had 87 B-52s taking off in 3 ship cells, 10 minutes apart, and the launching of the force from Guam took over 2 hours to launch all the aircraft. We flew about a 10 and a half hour round trip, only broken up by about 15 minutes of excitement when you're going over Hanoi.
The North Vietnamese retaliated with surface-to-air missiles, or SAMs, provided by the Soviet Union. Clifford Henry was a B-52 pilot who eventually retired in Louisiana.
We ended up getting hit pretty hard. When we were flying over there, I think in 11 days we lost 15 B-52s. I think only one of them was shot down by a MiG, which the North Vietnamese were flying. The others were shot down by SAMs.
Blofus and his crew dug in their heels on the second day when the decision was made to fly the exact same bombing routes.
We're not going to go in the same way because they know where we are and where we're going to be. The only stipulation they made, they said, well, you can change your altitudes. So instead of going in at 35,000 feet, we went in at 30,000 feet. And the missiles were going over the top of us, and which saved a lot of lives because we didn't lose anybody the second day. It was called the 11-Day War, and the only day we were down was Christmas Day, and that wasn't really to celebrate the birth of the Christ child. We needed maintenance. We needed help on getting the aircraft all together for the continuance.
After the Christmas Day pause, Nixon ordered the resumption of Linebacker II until December 29th. It achieved its goal of bringing the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table to conclude the Paris peace talks, but the losses to the U.S. were heavy.
33 crew members were killed, 33 more were taken prisoner, and over 25 were ultimately rescued when their damaged aircraft went down in neighboring countries.
A Linebacker II memorial on the grounds of Barksdale commemorates the operation and pays tribute to the crew members who sacrificed their lives in this ultimate push towards peace.
The fall of Saigon, the end of war, it's when everything stopped.
In 1975, American troops pulled out as the Communist North Vietnamese Army advanced to take over South Vietnam. More than 20,000 refugees fled in search of a new home in Louisiana.
I just go. I didn't think about whatever it is ahead of me. I have no concept. As long as I find another piece of land, that is a freedom. The 5th morning, I saw the seagull. That is a sign of life, a sign of hope.
The Archdiocese of Louisiana helped thousands build a new life, mostly in New Orleans and on the coast.
New Orleans is another Vietnam because Vietnam was ran through by the Mekong River. New Orleans is also cut through by the Mississippi Delta. It's fertile, especially New Orleans East is away from city, from town, and therefore they can grow vegetable. It's close to seashore, and so fishing industry is fertile.
This close-knit community, devastated by Katrina and again by the BP oil spill, has adapted to new challenges while holding tight to the rich traditions of Vietnamese culture, bound by faith.
After leaving Vietnam, what else did you have left except faith? You lost everything. The 10,000-day war left us so much of pain, but then those remarkable memories cannot be forgotten.
Nothing has brought me more nightmares than what happened to me in April of 1975 when I'm watching on TV and seeing places that I had been overrun by the enemy. We left 420 people on the roof of the American Embassy. I feel real badly about that. Should we have stayed? You know, I can't answer that question.
For many Louisiana veterans, returning home was a blessing, but also a painful experience.
I think the overall largest problem of all was the lack of support from folks back home. I remember going to a party with my high school chums, and I was an outcast because I went to Vietnam and I was a baby killer, which was not true.
Black I wear this cap there frequently. When I first came back, I wouldn't dare wear that cap. If they knew you was in combat or you was in Vietnam, maybe killing people, then people had a different view of you. I tried to tell them, I said, I went there to serve my country. And now I served my country and I came back. I did everything they told me to do, I did it.
I went and I did my duty and I came back and it was not pleasant coming back. And I had to totally reacclimate to civilization, really.
Many veterans still feel the scars of war, facing health effects from exposure to Agent Orange and other chemicals used against the Viet Cong. Others still cope with mental health issues.
I don't like to be around crowds of people. Sometimes I get angry, fast, but it's not a violent anger. It's just that any little thing irritates me, But I have no regrets of going there. I'm proud, happy that I served the country. I'm very confident that I made it back with the blessing of the Lord.
As time has passed, and as the country has aged and mellowed, people have started to show appreciation for the guys that went to Vietnam, and gals. And instead of spite, and instead of indignation, they are welcoming us.
Louisiana Public Broadcasting is recording your stories of the Vietnam War. For more information, go to lpb.org/Vietnam. To view these oral history interviews, visit LPB's Louisiana Digital Media Archive at ladigitalmedia.org. We also invite veterans to the LPB studio to sign the large-scale map of the Vietnam War theater.
Support for this program comes from Louisiana Companies and Querbees and Nelson, empowering clients with the know-how and products they need with over 100 years of experience. There is much to be learned from our history and the past, and we are proud to support this program and LPB. And by the men and women of the Louisiana Forestry Association. For sustainability, LFA members work to promote the health and productivity of Louisiana's forest for generations to come. And by DIMCO, proud to honor Louisiana's Vietnam veterans. As one of the fastest growing electrical co-ops in the nation, DIMCO is committed to our members and the community. DIMCO, your touchtone energy cooperative.
For a copy of this program, visit us online at lpb.org or call 1-800-973-7246.